Okay, I think we'll go ahead and get started. I just want to say a big welcome to everyone and say thank you for being here today. My name is Gina Henry, and I'm the Associate Dean for Advancement for the College of Engineering. Last year, as some of you know who have been watching this seminar series, we kicked off this new series called Faculty Insights, a 20-minute briefing. And in this series, faculty from across the College of Engineering share insights into their research and the research's impact and provide perspective for the future. Following each of these 20-minute presentations, all attendees will have an opportunity to ask questions and direct comments to our speaker. And our speaker today, I'm very happy to announce, is Coty Jen. And Coty Jen is an assistant professor of chemical engineering here at Carnegie Mellon University. She received her BS in chemical engineering at Columbia University in 2010, her MS in chemical engineering at the University of Minnesota Twin Cities in 2013, and her PhD in mechanical engineering at the University of Minnesota in 2015. She also completed a postdoc at University of California, Berkeley in 2018. She joined Carnegie Mellon University chemical engineering faculty that same year in 2018, later that year. The Jen Research Lab is part of the Center for Atmospheric Particle Studies at CMU. And this center focuses on developing a holistic approach to characterize atmospheric nanoparticles. Coty's research examines the life cycle of aerosol particles in the atmosphere and how these particles ultimately affect air quality and the environment. Specifically, she researches how gaseous compounds emitted from various sources react to and form and grow aerosol particles in the atmosphere. And so she studies particle growth pathways and develops models for aerosol particles in the atmosphere and specializes in the design of nanoparticle sizers, counters, and chemical speciators. Coty, thank you so much for being here today to educate us about your research and share some insights with us. But before I turn things over to Coty, just a note for everyone who's attending here today, please remember to submit any questions that you may have for Coty via the Q&A feature, and you should see a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. And you can ask a question or make a comment at any point during the presentation. And if you're comfortable doing so, please include your name with your question. And Sarah Smith, who's also on screen with us, who's the Associate Director of Development for the College of Engineering. She's going to be moderating the question and answer session with Coty at the conclusion of Coty's presentation. So at this point, I want to turn things over to Coty. Thank you so much, Coty.
Thank you for the great introduction. I always seem to forget how many places I've been. When I was applying for faculty positions, my dad was like, so you lived in the East Coast and the Midwest and now the West Coast. Does that mean you have to move to Hawaii? And I said, maybe, Dad, maybe. But I ended up in Pittsburgh, which is exactly where I wanted to be. So it works out well. So this is a really exciting opportunity for me to talk about the really cool work that my group has been doing. And as Gina mentioned, that we are part of the Center for Atmospheric Particle Studies. And this is a group of 9 faculty, I think 9 faculty across many departments in CIT and across multiple colleges like MCS. And we are very focused on understanding what is in our air. And the goal of my research group is not just understanding what is in the air, but how is the air going to change as the climate changes? And so there's all these very complicated feedback loops that are happening around us, and we're going to touch upon some of them in this presentation. And so the work that's done in our lab is funded primarily by the National Science Foundation and the Department of Energy. And a lot of the wildfire research is being funded by the California Air Resource Board. And so the next 20 or so minutes, we're going to be talking about climate change and how it's going to change the atmosphere over the next 10 years, 20 years, and so on and so forth. So first, the foundational slide, which is the climate is changing. There is no way around this. This is actually really well-timed talk, given that all the world leaders right now are meeting to discuss more or less the fate of the world. And here's a reminder of how the climate is changing. It's not just getting warmer, but every aspect of our life is being impacted by climate change. I used to live in California. I lived in the Bay Area for 3 years. And when I was living there, it was just kind of like the middle of the first few years of the drought. And we were seeing increasing wildfires in California and in the Western US in general. I remember living there. Unfortunately, the fires didn't get that close to the Bay Area, but it did burn down large portions of Napa County and Sonoma County and Santa Rosa while I was there. But it was the smoke. We were talking maybe 1 week, 2 weeks of solid smoke exposure. And breathing that in, I mean, my friends and I, we would wake up in the morning, we would have bloody noses, we have headaches, and these are just becoming more and more common. If you live anywhere in the Western US, you have experienced smoke inhalation from the wildfires. And this is definitely due to climate change. It's from increasing temperatures, it's from drier drought spells, it's from less snow melt, earlier spring, so on and so forth. In addition to more wildfires, we also are getting more extreme weather events. So this is a satellite photo from NASA actually taken last year. And you see that there's actually 4, maybe 5 hurricanes that are formed in a variety of parts of the ocean. And last summer was an unusually active hurricane season. We even ran out of letters and had to move to Greek letters to start naming the tropical storms. And I mean, large portions of the US were battered by hurricane after hurricane, and many of these places haven't even recovered. And all of these hurricanes and all of these severe weather patterns are also changing the air that we're breathing in. And it's not just the rain, but it's also the aftermath. It's the destruction and the decay that's changing the air we're breathing. And in some of the cases in like North Carolina, you get toxic spills caused by the severe weather events. In this top picture here, also taken from NASA, is actually a seaweed bloom that happened in the doldrums or the Sargassum Sea, kind of, if we go to this map here, kind of down in this area. It was such a large seaweed bloom that the satellites could pick it up. And the seaweed actually beached on all of the Caribbean islands, on many parts of Florida. And we're talking not just like a little bit of seaweed, we're talking about the whole beach was coated in Sargassum seaweed. And the seaweed is not only a nuisance, it suppresses tourists from wanting to go to the beach, but also smells awful, like rotting eggs. It smells like ammonia. It is just totally unpleasant to be around. And these large scale seaweed blooms and beaching events are also changing the air people are breathing in along the coastline and what's happening in the middle of the ocean. And the last thing that also is really impacted by climate change that we touched upon for the wildfires is drought. Large fraction of the Western US, and it's starting to creep actually into the Midwest, is under drought watch or drought warning. And I was actually at Lake Mead not that long ago, maybe in May. And this photo, I did not take this from Getty, but here's a photo of the Hoover Dam with Lake Mead. And normally, whatever normally means, the water level comes up to kind of where these towers are, where the lines are towards the top of the tower. And you can see that the water level has dropped in Lake Mead in the reservoir by, significant amounts, to the point that we're saying that the Hoover Dam will not be operational anymore. And this was never envisioned by the engineers when they built the dam. And so the drought in itself is changing, not only causing more wildfires, but it's also changing the types of plants that can grow and the types of fauna that could live there, which is also changing what is emitted into the atmosphere. And so climate change is all encompassing. It feels like every day we get a new news article or a new science paper coming out tying a new, really kind of depressing phenomena to climate change. And this will not stop. Climate is everywhere. And as it changes, it will change many of these processes that we observe around us. And so climate change is also changing what is being emitted into the air. And so here's kind of a cartoon showing what my group is specifically interested in when we talk about the atmosphere. And so here we get a little bit of the ocean, we see some sand like from the beach, and then we get some of the land, and we see some of the trees are on fire. The ocean, the land, the sand, all of this is impacted by climate change. I mentioned to you before that the seaweed is blooming more frequently, so we get crazy amounts of sulfur emission coming from the seaweed as it blooms. We also get more intense sea salt that is emitted to the air during extreme weather events and more mineral dust. And because of the drought and because of just more humans living in drought areas, we get a lot more biomass or wildfire events occurring. And all of these processes, and there's many, many more, are adding things into the atmosphere that we are unable to predict right now. And so these compounds that we put into the air could either go on and form these tiny little nanoparticles, and I'll go more into these nanoparticles later, or they can directly form some of these nanoparticles, like the soot you get emitted from like burning trees or so on and so forth. So if all of these sources on the bottom are changing with climate, and all of their downstream chemical reactions are changing what we breathe, what I'm telling you now is all of these things in the air will go on and actually help form clouds. And clouds, besides looking fluffy and kind of relaxing to stare at, are actually a major, major part on how quickly the planet is warming. Clouds serve as basically mirrors for the planet. They reflect sunlight away. They're white, and they help reflect sunlight away from the planet, which actually serves to cool the planet down. And so this increased cloud coverage, because we're emitting more junk into the atmosphere, is one of the feedback loops that we're trying to understand when we're trying to model climate change over the next so many decades. So how do things at this very initial source, how are those changing because of climate? And how will that ultimately impact how clouds are going to cool the planet? So this is a pretty complicated feedback loop. And this is a feedback loop we've been kind of thinking about for actually many decades. And so here's a graph on the y-axis, or on the left-hand side. It's a term we use called radiative forcing. Radiative forcing means how much radiation is making it to the planet due to human-induced factors. So this is all because of people. And the red bar, the first one, is CO2. And hopefully many of you know that CO2 is the dominant greenhouse gas that humans have emitted into the atmosphere. And it is a positive radiative forcing because it's warming the planet. And in addition to warming the planet to a pretty large extent, this is a pretty tall bar, we also see on this bar, there's a small error bar associated with it. And this error bar reflects our understanding of how CO2 is changing the climate. That error bar is quite small. It's because we are very, very confident on how CO2 is changing the climate, especially over the next few decades. The only thing that's uncertain about this is we don't know how humans are going to be able to cut back their carbon dioxide emissions. So that's where a good chunk of that error bar comes from. The next bar is other greenhouse gases like methane and other greenhouse gases. And this we have a pretty good understanding as well. It's also going to warm the planet, hence the positive red. But to the right, we see there's two blue bars. And the first one is aerosol radiative forcing. So this is particles in the air that are, kind of whitish, like sometimes you burn campfires outside, it's kind of making like this white smoke. That will cause some of the radiation from the sun to bounce back out into space, and that helps cool the planet. And another one is cloud radiative forcing. So how much of this cloud is bouncing the sunlight away from the planet? And both of these are cooling. That's why they're negative radiative forcing. But what's scary for some, I find it pretty interesting, are these huge error bars. These error bars, if we took it to all the way extreme, could, not completely, but does to some extent balance out some of the greenhouse gas warming. So if we actually narrow down these error bars, we could actually be over predicting how quickly the planet is warming. And the reason why these error bars are so large is because of this complex cycle of sources on the ground or in the ocean emitting, and those compounds reacting, forming particles, and then those particles going on to form clouds. It's a very complicated process. And because it's so complicated, these error bars are very, very large. And over the many decades that the IPCC has been publishing these reports, these error bars actually haven't changed. What is kind of I shouldn't say joke, but these error bars, the actual magnitude hasn't changed, but our understanding of what is behind the error bars has really improved over the last decade. And the reason why these error bars are still very large is because we're actually missing a lot of these measurements. And so before I go into all these complex processes, the focus of a lot of research in our field is trying to understand how do we go from a gas phase molecule to a particle that can then go on and form a cloud. So here's kind of like the life cycle of a particle in the atmosphere. And we start with all these gas phase compounds. And these compounds could come from the land, come from the ocean, could come from people. The ones that we really care about are sulfuric acid. That's a compound that's emitted from burning coal or from fossil fuels, or also from seaweed emissions in the ocean or phytoplankton emissions in the ocean as well. So that has both human-induced components and biogenic or natural components. In addition to sulfuric acid, we care about ammonia and a lot of other atmospheric bases that exist around. But these are just molecules. They're quite small, maybe 1 angstrom in size, and randomly they will collide with each other and they will react to form stable particles. These particles are about 1 nanometer in diameter, not very big, maybe a couple of molecules loosely clumped together. And then from there, they just grow larger. They go from 1 nanometer all the way up to 50 to 100 nanometers. It's just a rapid condensation of whatever is around them in the atmosphere to form these very large particles. You still can't see them by eye, but large in that we're talking millions and millions of molecules within that particle. When they reach this size, they can actually start forming clouds. They're the perfect size for seeds, for water to condense upon, to form cloud droplets. And cloud droplets are roughly 1 to 10 micron in size. And this we can see, it reflects a lot of, scatters a lot of light. And this is the nice fluffy clouds we see above us. And so my group, so each of these processes, this first step is called nucleation. So we go from gas to particle phase. And then after that, these particles just grow larger and larger. And then when they're seed particles, and they turn into cloud droplets. That's a process known as activation. So my group focuses primarily on nucleation and growth. And so the reason why we really care about nucleation and growth is because these compounds somehow seems almost magical, almost seems magical, somehow go from just being gas phase molecules to particles. And so this seems like a pretty interesting chemical reaction. It feels like it's very doable for us to measure this and get the kinetics, but it's extremely challenging to measure for 2 reasons. One, measuring a 1 nanometer particle is really difficult. These molecules are very loosely held together, and if you poke it, they fall apart. And so getting an instrument to hold it together just long enough to detect it is very challenging. Another issue is these gas compounds and these particles are basically at trace contaminant concentrations of the atmosphere. We're talking part per billion level. And to put that in perspective, we had to make an instrument that can detect the volume of a marble of the volume of Mount Everest. So we had to make extremely sensitive, extremely careful instruments to have any chance at measuring these reactions. And these reactions are important because without these reactions, we wouldn't have any seed particles for cloud formation. And so these reactions can occur anywhere. A lot of these sources are above the ocean or from the ocean, and a lot of them are above land. We've observed nucleation reactions occurring in both of these places. And we also are predicting now, this is where the field is going, we're predicting now that these reactions can actually occur pretty far up from the surface, like maybe a kilometer from ground level or ocean level above. And we actually really care about these higher altitude reactions, because if you can form particles 1 kilometer above the surface, this is actually where clouds form. So reactions that occur up there have a much higher probability of impacting how much cloud coverage there is around the planet. And again, clouds are important because it's helping reflect more solar radiation away. So if we can nail down and better constrain these processes, like what is the ocean emitting, what is the land emitting, and how are they reacting, we can better predict cloud coverage and how much of the clouds are reflecting solar radiation from the planet. And so the major challenge is not just, thinking and drawing really cool cartoons like this about where we should go measure. It's actually going to take these measurements. Because I can design whatever model I want, but if we don't have measurements to back it up, it's kind of a garbage model. And so how do we bring instruments to the middle of the ocean or to 1 kilometer above the ground to measure some of these complex reactions? And traditionally, the instruments we use are about the size of a fridge, and they require, on a good day, maybe like 15 amps of power. And I don't know about you. I'm not a pro electrician, but daisy chaining 1 kilometer of electrical cords, power extension cords, is not a good idea. And so we have been unable to take measurements at this type of altitude or in the middle of the ocean because we're limited by the sheer size of our instruments. And another reason why we want to go take more and more measurements is kind of what this graph is telling us here. And so here's a plot, a graph of the world. We see North America, Africa, Asia, South America, and Australia. And the red is telling you how important nucleation is in forming clouds. So the redder it is means those clouds are the result of nucleation occurring in that region. So this is a pretty crude model, actually. This model threw in a really basic nucleation reaction scheme and kind of did a prediction. But what was interesting was it's telling us that we had to take our instruments, not just all around North America and all around like parts of Europe and Russia and Australia, but we had to start going into the middle of the ocean. We had to start going into the Arctic Ocean or to Antarctica. And these places are really kind of difficult to take measurements if you need like 30 amps of power and a very constant source of like clean gases and things like that. And so if we want to improve this model, if we want to do a better job in predicting how the climate will change in the future, we have to go to these remote regions and at higher altitudes to take these measurements. And so we've been working with a series of partners, both in industry and at national labs, to develop this instrument. And in order to develop this small compact instrument to bring, we actually had to redo how nucleation is thought of. And we actually really simplified it down. And this reaction, I know many of you in the audience don't have a chemistry background, but this reaction, I promise you, is very, very simple. The first step of the reaction is we have an acid, and it collides with the base, and it forms a little cluster of 2 molecules, and we call that the monomer. And the monomer just hits another monomer to form a dimer, and the dimer hits another monomer to form a trimer, and the trimer hits another monomer to form a tetramer. This is our nucleation model. We threw out a lot of the crazy, like sulfuric acid plus ammonia at this specific rate. We threw all that out in favor of this very simplistic model because we are really good at measuring acid and really good at measuring the tetramer. And with these 2 inputs, we can actually back calculate how much base molecule or how much acid molecule, depending on how we set up the system. We can do this back calculation and take this measurement. And what this actually means, not only we have a simple model, what this actually means is we can just have an instrument and not worry about measuring specific acids or specific bases. We can just go and measure one thing, which is just particle counts, which is N4. And so this little instrument is a condensation particle counter. You don't need to know the details, but what you should know is it's very small. It's maybe the size of like a lunchbox. It can run off a battery for easily a day. It's extremely robust. Our partner is Aerosol Dynamics, the company in California, just sent one, I think, last year up to the International Space Station. So very robust. We've been bringing them around to different parts of the world as well. And so now we can access all those remote regions and start taking these measurements to understand how these reactions are happening, how these particles are forming, and how that's actually changing as the emissions from the ocean and land are changing with time. So this is a super exciting development. And again, we're working with our partners to get this commercialized. And so we're taking this technology, we're taking this model we built, and we're going to go measure things that we know are changing with time. And one of them is what humans are emitting, specifically industries. And so my student, Sandra Fomete, who's going to graduate soon, was really curious about carbon capture technologies. And these industries are trying to, not emit as much CO2, which is great. And they're using compounds like monoethanolamine or other, basic gases to capture CO2 before it's emitted into the atmosphere. What we found is as these companies use more and more of these amine compounds, that a lot of it's leaking out into the atmosphere and can actually form more of these particles in the regional airshed. And these new particles then go on to form a bunch of clouds, some part downwind. And we also discovered, because of the pandemic, a lot of consumer care products have these exact same amine compounds in them. They're used as oftentimes as surfactants, or they kind of give that slimy feel when you put those alcohol wipes on your hands. And we're noticing those are also emitted into the atmosphere at a pretty good clip and helping to form a lot of the nanoparticles that are around in that air as well. And so this was a really exciting study that we're showing that as we push more and more carbon capture technologies, we should expect more new particle formation or nucleation events occurring in that region. In addition to that, we have a student looking at ocean chemistry. The ocean is rapidly changing with temperature. It's not just the temperature that's changing it, but also more nutrients are going into the ocean because of deforestation and because of wildfires. And in addition, we have higher CO2 concentrations in the ocean because, again, there's more CO2 in the atmosphere. And so this is causing large-scale algae blooms almost everywhere. I talked about Sargassum, which is a type of macroalgae or seaweed. This is blooming in what we thought before was kind of like a dead zone of the ocean, not much growing there. And our models don't actually include anything growing there and have almost no emissions. But now we're seeing tons of seaweed biomass there, emitting all of these really fun sulfur and amine compounds, which then go on to form particles, which then go on to form clouds. In addition to seaweed, we also see a lot of phytoplankton blooms, and these actually emit very similar compounds that can go on and form particles and more clouds. And so as the climate is changing, we're inputting more CO2 and we're inputting more nutrients, and we're changing the acidity of the ocean that will actually favor more seaweed or more phytoplankton blooms in areas that our models are not capturing at all at the moment. So the goal of one of my students' thesis project is how do we predict seaweed blooms and its impact on the atmospheric chemistry like 10 years from now when we get more and more nutrients going in. And so in addition to seaweed blooms, in addition to more carbon capture technologies, we're also very, very concerned about the amount of the atmosphere is changing because of wildfires. Again, I lived in California for a good chunk of time. I always think about wildfires now. And wildfires produce a lot of the compounds that float around in the planet. And more frequent wildfires aren't just going to impact California air or Idaho air or Washington state air. It's going to impact everyone's air. So here's a satellite photo taken from last year. And this was from the fires that you probably saw, like the apocalypse photos from the Bay Area in the news. Is from that fire. So this time in September last year. And the red dots indicate all the active fires that were observed. Some of them are small. They're probably agricultural burns. The big ones are definitely large-scale wildfires. This haze you see in the satellite image is actually smoke. Smoke can travel extremely far. I did my PhD in Minneapolis, which is somewhere around here-ish in the photo. We often experienced long periods of smoke from Western US and from Canadian wildfires. For a couple of days in Pittsburgh, we got quite a bit of the smoke from California, sometimes from Canada as well. I mean, it doesn't matter where you live in this country, you will be impacted by smoke. And the smoke the compounds in smoke are very exotic to an atmospheric chemist, very exotic. And so it leads to a lot of questions like, what is the chemistry of these compounds? How is it going to impact our health? And how is it going to impact some things down in this feedback cycle when we talk about climate change? So the first thing that my group is really concerned about is, well, there's a huge push to prevent wildfires. That's a good thing. And to prevent them, we being forest managers, will go into the forest and do prescribed burns. These are low temperature burns just to remove all the built up fuel from the last 100 years. So here's a picture. This is actually during my postdoc. This is me in a prescribed burn where they lit part of the forest floor on fire just to clear out all the pine needles and some of the leaves and the duffs and the rotting logs on the ground. And we're preventing wildfires by reducing the amount of fuel, but the downside is we're also producing a ton of smoke. So as we try to increase the amount of prescribed burning we're doing, how is this smoke going to impact the people that live in the forested regions? How will it impact firefighters or forest managers who are here lighting the fires? Or how will it impact something much further downwind? And so my group right now is the project led by Farah and my other student, Deanna. they're characterizing smoke, and they've noticed that the smoke samples they collected from this prescribed burn and another one that we went to in May has roughly 100,000 unique organic and inorganic compounds. This is a mind-blowing number of unique compounds. And all of these compounds do different things. Some of them look like this crazy ring, and we know this crazy ring can cause cancer. Some of them we know nothing about for the health impacts. So we partnered with Liz Wayne, who's another colleague here in chemical engineering and BME at CMU. And we're trying to understand how these compounds ultimately make it down into the lungs and impact a lot of our health outcomes. Like, how does it change the macrophage response inside these cells, inside the lung airways, or how it passes into the blood circulation and gets to the heart of the brain. So we're doing a lot of these cell studies to look at that. In addition, my student who's working on seaweed, we've also noticed, and there's a couple of papers just recently published on this, that wildfires are changing where seaweed is blooming in the ocean. And so here's two studies that came out, one in 2019 and one in 2021. Here's the seaweed sargassum bloom that I was mentioning before that was beaching on the oceans. This was caused, they think, by the increased nutrients that was deposited by the wildfire smoke from the fires in Western Africa and from runoff from the Amazon. So we think that the smoke is depositing, causing a nice environment for seaweed to bloom, which then causes it to bloom, which then takes over the beaches and all the areas of the Gulf of Mexico. This study came out maybe a month ago, and it linked the large-scale Australian wildfires that happened in the summer 2019 to 2020. So this was winter our time, but summer their time. They linked the smoke that deposited in the ocean to two large-scale phytoplankton blooms off the coast of Australia, one near Australia and one further away. And these are large blooms covering large parts of the ocean. And these phytoplankton blooms are emitting compounds that we are not capturing in our models at all. And so these are really interesting feedback loops that wildfires seem to really, you think it only impacts land, but it's impacting the ocean and it's impacting the atmosphere. So how do we measure all of this and capture it so we can actually predict it as we move into the future? And so this is a kind of a summary of my research. So we're looking at not just individual sources, but we're looking at how all these sources are related. How are they going to change over the next decade or 20 years? And in order to answer the how is it going to change, we work on developing cool new instruments that allow us to go take these measurements in difficult locations. And then we like going to these cool new places. We're going to go to Oklahoma, I think, in 2 years. We're hoping to go to Bermuda to measure some seaweed emissions. So we go out into the field and take measurements. And then we're also developing models that go into the large-scale climate models that help predict how the radiation making to the planet or how the climate is going to change in the future. And so all three of the aspects are needed for us to answer the question of how is the climate going to change the atmosphere as we move forward. And so here's two pictures of my group. We went on a retreat to Maryland. I've never eaten so many crabs in my life. This is me, and here are 4 of my students. Some of them couldn't make it. And then here's my full group. We actually just got a new group member the other day. We have Farah and Deanna doing the wildfire research, Sandra, Dom, and Jack, and Darren doing a lot of the new particle formation instrument development work. And with that, I will gladly take any questions that the audience may have. Thank you.
Thank you, Coty. We really appreciate your speaking here today. So thank you very much. So I'd like to take some questions now. As a reminder, you may submit your questions in the Q&A part of the bottom tab chapter if you can right there. Please sure to include your name if you would like with your question. If you'd like to remain anonymous, that's okay as well. So one of the first questions, Coty, I'll start off nice and easy, was whether your group is considered mostly PhD master students or if you have any undergraduates who are also interested in this research.
Yeah, so my group is primarily PhD students. This is mind-blowing. I have 8 PhD students. I don't know how that happened. They're all amazing students. That I also have a number of undergrads. One of my undergrads just graduated this past spring and now works at Ramble. I have another undergraduate who is not working with me this spring because he got an internship. And I have another undergraduate who's a senior. She's actually building seaweed tanks for me right now. So it's super cool. And she wants to go to graduate school in oceanography. I'm like, yes, do oceanography. So my group is primarily like a couple of undergrads and very PhD heavy. And we occasionally will have master's students with doing computational of our data analysis.
Okay, wonderful. Have you thought about or distinguished between human man-made causes versus natural caused or natural variation at all with your research?
So it's kind of, so in our field, we tend to label things as like anthropogenic, which is human caused, and then biogenic, which is natural. And that's starting to blur together now. So when we talk about, like, let's take a seaweed bloom, a lot of seaweed blooms are being driven by human factors. Like that seaweed wouldn't have bloomed there because if we wouldn't have cut down a large chunk of the Amazon rainforest, we wouldn't have the nutrient runoff into the ocean that led to that. So these classifications are not useful anymore. In my mind, with the climate changing, everything is human induced. If we're talking about natural variations of like weather or of temperature, there's been many studies that have shown natural variations happen over a much larger time scale than what we're looking at. And so while I do agree that it's difficult to attribute very specific things to climate, like human induced climate change, like you can't say, oh, this hurricane was so bad because of climate, but we're seeing like an increased frequency, like this heightened pattern with time that is definitely pointing to these are because the climate is changing.
Okay, wonderful. A couple of questions. You talked about one of the issues you're having is capturing things above the ocean. So how are some maybe recent technologies, you mentioned one, but what other technologies are out there that maybe we could use to capture some of these products? Or in your great design, what are you thinking about within your group?
Yeah, so actually the one part we're kind of pushing is a lot of these unmanned, what are they called? UAVs, unmanned aerial vehicles. So drones, drones are the cooler name, and students love working with drones. Commercial, like consumer drones that we buy can't stay in the air very long. Commercial or military grade drones can, and there's actually a lot of government funding agencies that want to use these drones to facilitate a lot of these atmospheric measurements. So these drones can stay in the air for days, which is kind of terrifying because these are definitely military grade drones. But they stay up for days and actually carry a pretty significant payload at 1 kilometer altitude at pretty nice spatial resolution too. So that is something we're hoping to move towards in the future.
Okay, great, wonderful. Let's see, we had another question just on natural phenomenon. So in terms of the difference, I think you already talked about it's all human or there's some component of that frequency. What are you seeing in terms of that frequency change? You know, you talked about your work from 2018 versus what you guys are producing now. What big of a rate are we increasing by in terms of some of those frequencies?
Like frequencies of like,
the question is about like frequency of, for example, wildfires or hurricanes, natural volcanic eruptions, those types of, I would say, natural tendencies.
So I'll start with volcanic eruptions. We actually, as atmospheric scientists, like when a volcano erupts because it's a great time for us to test if our climate models are working. Because this is like one of the natural cases where a whole bunch of particles get released high up in the atmosphere and help form clouds. And we can actually measure local cooling events in those areas where there's a lot of cloud ash. And then it actually agrees phenomenally well with our climate models. And so that gives us a lot of confidence that our climate models are capturing a lot of what we needed to capture when we talk about, you know, greenhouse gas warming, how much radiation taking it to the planet versus when we inject a whole bunch of particles into the air. Other natural variations. So when we talk about outside of volcanoes like wildfires, wildfires have become more and more frequent over the last, and there's, I don't do the wildfire prediction models, but there's been quite a few papers out there that have observed high frequency wildfires, and we'll continue to see higher frequency wildfires over the next, I think the last paper I saw predicted out to 2050 or 2060 in the Western US and in Australia and large parts of Siberia. There's a lot of reasons why we're seeing more wildfires, and almost all of them are because of humans. climate change is one of them. Another one is because people are living in these places that have not historically lived in them before. So we're now running power lines into, these forests that never had power lines before. So now you're providing a way to ignite fuel. Another reason is we actually prevented people, mostly Native Americans, from managing the forest about 120 years ago or so in the Western US. And they did an excellent job keeping the fuel loadings down in those areas. And now, because we've been suppressing fires for so many decades, there's just so much built up fuel in these areas that whenever there's ignition, like a gender reveal party or a boy tossing a firecracker down a canyon to scare his friends, like whenever that happens, it will ignite. What's causing these fires to be larger is because of climate change. There is just no more water in these regions. The drought is really bad. Parts of California, I mean, the soil is sinking because the aquifer is depleted. There's just not snow in these areas that, provide a lot of the moisture. So you have dry conditions, you have more people living there. It's just asking for it to be burned. Hopefully that answers that question. I think maybe I missed part of it.
No, you did great. And just a quick reminder for anyone, if you would like any questions for Jody, please go ahead and submit them in the Q&A as well. Another question, you talked about, carbon capture and some of the different byproducts with that. That's obviously in the news a lot right now with Scotland going on in carbon capture and a lot of our oil and gas companies talking about being carbon neutral. How does that play into the byproduct? If they're able to do that, how does that relate to some of your research? You mentioned a couple of different, byproduct gases.
Yeah. So it's a really interesting question. It's something my group has thought quite a bit about. So let's say we do increase the amount of carbon capture, which is actually what a lot of industries want to do. It is much easier to put something downstream of your process than totally retool your whole process. It's cheaper, it's easier to implement. And so if they did that, we're going to be emitting all of these compounds into the atmosphere that we know can form these particles. And these particles serve like a net cooling effect on the planet. And so that seems like a good thing, right? You not only capture the carbon, but you're also putting particles in the air that cool the planet. And this is kind of like the basis of a lot of geoengineering thought experiments that are happening right now. The downside is breathing in these tiny little particles is actually really bad for your health. We talked about it in one of the slides about smoke. Breathing in smoke we know is bad for you. All those health impacts have been studied. We know that breathing in tiny particles of these amine compounds, we're seeing a lot of evidence now that it's also very bad for you. And so, yeah, it could help cool the planet, but it's also going to make a lot of the people's lives who live there pretty miserable. And this is kind of always like the trade-off. Like you save one part, like we could put a whole bunch of ozone around. Ozone is really bad for us, breathing it in, but much better for absorbing UV radiation and whatnot, much higher in the atmosphere. So it's definitely a trade-off. And I don't have a good comment on what industry should or should not be doing carbon capture technology-wise. All I can say is capturing carbon from an industrial process doesn't solve the net problem, which is there's too much carbon in the atmosphere. So there still needs to be carbon removal from the atmosphere for us to have any chance at reducing the heating of the planet, basically.
Okay, great. Well, that was our last. Oh wait, I think there's one more question. Here we go. How will we communicate more results? Where can people go to kind of follow your research, see what you're doing, and see some new results that you'll be having as your group processes through all the data you're collecting?
Yeah, so much data. 8 graduate students. Yeah, no, that's a really great question. And I fully admit I am not very socially connected with the I guess Facebook renamed itself, the metaverse or whatever. My students are incredibly connected with the social media world. A lot of our really exciting results get published both on our website and we announce when we have papers published through our website and through Twitter. A lot of our really cool work is highlighted by our department, which I'm really grateful for. So a lot of our PR people in our department, I work with them closely to announce any of our cool new results. But if you ever want to get in touch and want to learn more, I'm always happy to chat with whoever. So feel free to send me an email if you want to know what's happening. But we also, this is kind of side note, we also work with a lot of local students and high school teachers with our outreach activities. We partner with local science teachers and students to kind of move not just our results, but just climate literacy into the Pittsburgh curriculum, and air quality, because Pittsburgh has some pretty bad air quality.
Wonderful. Well, I think we're at there for time. So thank you very much, Coty, and thank you everyone for joining us today. As a reminder, we will be sending out an email with a link for today's session that we've been recording. And please be on the watch out for future faculty insights that will be coming up in the next couple months. So thank you, everyone, and have a wonderful weekend. Thank you, Coty, again.